Chapter 4, Mishnah 1. This chapter continues to discuss the laws of an animal that attacks another animal. The first Mishnah cites a dispute about how damages are paid if a tom ox injured several animals, each of which is owned by a different person. If an ox gored 4 or 5 oxen, one after the other while remaining a tom, its owner pays the half damage payment to the last victim, and the others do not receive anything. This law applies in a specific situation, namely, where each victim seized the ox that gored in order to make sure that he would be paid. Once it is in his possession, he is responsible for any damage it does later. After the ox gored the first time, the victim seized it. Thus, when it gored the second time, it is the first victim, not the owner, who must pay. The second victim then seized the ox from the first victim. Thus, when it gored the third time, the second victim must pay. The third victim then seized the ox, and so on. If the half damage payment due each victim is the same, for instance 100 zuz, the owner owes 100 zuz to the first victim, who owes 100 zuz to the second victim, who owes 100 to the third, etc. The last victim, however, does not owe anything, since the ox did not do any damage after he seized it. Thus, only the last victim gets to keep his payment, i.e. 100 zuz of the animal that he seized, while the others receive nothing. However, if the amount owed the second to last victim is more than the amount owed the last victim returns the difference to the one that came before him, i.e. the second to last victim. For example, every victim owes 100 zuz to the one that came after him, except for the second to last victim, who owes only 50 zuz to the last one. In this case, the last victim keeps for himself 50 zuz of the animal that he took, and he gives the remaining 50 zuz to the second to last victim. Here too, the last victim receives everything he is owed, 50 zuz. However, the second to last victim receives less than what he is owed, 50 zuz out of 100, and the others receive nothing. And if the payment owed the third to last victim is more than the total of the payments owed the last two And if the payment owed the third to last victim is more than the total of the payments owed the last two victims together, the last victim returns part of the remainder to the second to last victim and part to the third to last victim. For example, the payment due the third to last victim was 100 zuz. The payment due the second to last victim was 50 zuz. And the payment due the last victim was 20 zuz. In this case, where the last victim is entitled to only 20 zuz, he keeps just 20 zuz of the animal that he took. He gives 30 zuz, the difference between his payment and the previous victim's payment, to the previous victim. And he gives 50 zuz, the difference between the second to last victim's payment and the third to last victim's payment, to the third to last victim. Thus, the last victim keeps his full 20 zuz. The second to last victim gets 30 zuz, the 50 that he is owed minus the 20 that he owes. The third to last victim gets 50 zuz, the 100 that he is owed minus the 50 that he owes, and the other victims receive nothing. In every case, regardless of how much each victim is owed, the very last one benefits, since he is the only one who does not have to pay anyone else. These are the words of Rebbe Meir. According to the previous Tana, Rebbe Meir, if a victim seizes the ox that gored to collect his payment from it, he becomes entirely responsible for the ox and must pay for any damage it does in the future. However, if he does not seize it, he is not liable to pay anything. The next Tana, Rabbi Shimon, disagrees. In his view, even if the victim does not seize the ox that gored, he automatically acquires a share of the animal that equals the amount he is owed. He thus becomes a part owner of the ox together with the original owner and any other victims. And so he and the original owner share liability for damages. Rabbi Shimon says, if a tom ox worth 200 zuz gored an ox worth 200 zuz, killing it, and the carcass of the gored ox is worth nothing, the victim takes a maneh, 100 zuz, of the ox that gored as his half damage payment, and the owner gets to keep the remaining 100 zuz of the ox. Thus, the victim and the owner each own half of the animal. If it then gored another ox worth 200 zuz, killing it, and the carcass is worth nothing, the last one, i.e. the second victim, takes a mana, 100 zuz, as his half damage payment. He collects half of his 100 zuz from the first victim and half from the owner, 50 zuz from each, since each owns half the animal. Thus, the outcome regarding those who came before him, namely the first victim and the owner, is as follows. The first victim gets to keep 50 zuz of the animal, and the owner gets to keep 50 zuz of it. At this point, the second victim owns half of the animal, 100 zuz, the first victim owns a quarter, 50 zuz, and the original owner owns a quarter, 50 zuz. If the ox then gores another ox worth 200 zuz, killing it, and the carcass is worth nothing, the last one, i.e. the third victim, takes a mana, 100 zuz, as his half damage payment. He collects this 100 zuz from its three owners, the original owner, the first victim, and the second victim, in proportion to the share of the animal that each one owns. Thus, he takes half of his payment, 50 zuz, from the second victim, a quarter, 25 zuz, from the first victim, and a quarter, 25 zuz, from the original owner. It emerges that the second victim, who came before him, is left with 50 zuz, and each of the first two, the owner and the first victim, is left with a gold dinar, 25 zuz.